Okay, go ahead and get started. Welcome to the closing session of CLA Time Past, Time Present, Time Future. My name is Alan Love, and I'm a professor in the Department of Philosophy and director of the Minnesota Center for Philosophy of Science. It's okay. It's okay. Our theme this afternoon is Looking Forward, the CLA in 2068, though I imagine that some of you are also looking forward to the food, drink, and faculty bands that will follow in Memorial Hall immediately after. I only ask that for the next 90 minutes you heed the wisdom of Benjamin Franklin, who said, "He that can have patience can have what he will." As Dean Coleman recently reminded us in his State of the College address, there is a negative narrative about the liberal arts. On another occasion, we might review the recent results from a survey conducted by the Association of American Colleges and Universities, which found that business executives and hiring managers unanimously agreed that the skills and knowledge areas of greatest importance included oral communication, critical thinking, ethical judgment, working effectively in teams, self-motivation, and written communication. And on that other occasion, we might also review how the Career Readiness Initiative that Dean Coleman initiated with his roadmap aligns with these findings. However, that is for another occasion. Our goal this afternoon is not to focus on shattering expectations, but rather to formulate new expectations, to steer away from the crisis narrative and move toward visions of the future and for the future. I stress that visions is plural, and there is no assumption that a consensus is supposed to emerge or be revealed in the time we have together. Instead, we'll embark on this extended conversation about the future of the liberal arts and CLA through three different perspectives from current faculty members in the college. Each of these participants was charged with reflecting on three broad questions. What is the current state of the liberal arts in the modern research university? What challenges does the CLA face in the next 10 years? How could the liberal arts be conceived and studied 50 years from now? Importantly, these were only initial prompts for their reflections, and I especially encouraged them to concentrate on questions number 2 and 3 to keep the future at the forefront of our dialogue. Although these faculty members comprise only a small fraction of the diversity present in the CLA, they are well positioned to launch our discussion this afternoon. Let me briefly introduce each of them to you in alphabetical order. Timothy Brennan is professor in the Departments of Cultural Studies and Comparative Literature and English, and has been the Russell Chair in the Humanities since 2014. He works on the relationship between comparative literature, world literature, and global English. Professor Brennan's many publications, including numerous books such as Wars of Position, The Cultural Politics of Left and Right, deal with issues of intellectual history, cultural theory, the Marxist and phenomenological tradition, the avant-garde, theories of colonialism and imperialism, problems of translation, and popular music. He is a recipient of fellowships from the Fulbright Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the American Council of Learned Societies, the Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft, and the McKnight Foundation. Professor Brennan has been at the University of Minnesota since 1998. Kathryn Grace is Associate Professor in the Department of Geography, Environment, and Society. Her research focuses on food insecurity and maternal and child health in the context of climate change in West Africa, East Africa, and Central America, including how women manage their nutritional needs while pregnant and breastfeeding. Professor Grace published work in journals such as Food Security, Nature, Climate Change, and Population and Environment, uses survey data, focus groups, observations, and interviews, and various types of geophysical data to investigate the ways that people interact with their environment. She is the recipient of grants from NASA, the National Science Foundation, USAID, and the U.S. Geological Service. Professor Grace has been at the University of Minnesota since 2016. Kathryn Squires is Professor of Communication Studies and affiliated with Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies, African American and African Studies, and the Hubbard School of Journalism and Mass Communication, where she was Cowles Professor of Journalism, Diversity, and Equality from 2007 to 2013. Her work investigates the interactions between social identities, media discourses, and publics, and she is the author of several books, including The Post-Racial Mystique. Professor Squires partners with Gordon Parks High School and the Haley Q. Brown Center in St. Paul in collaboration with community members and high school students to deepen their knowledge about the school's and center's namesakes, as well as local African American history, and foster publicly oriented creative projects. She was the inaugural director of the Race, Indigeneity, Gender, and Sexuality Initiative here in CLA. Professor Squires has been at the University of Minnesota since 2007. We will begin with short 15-minute presentations from each of the participants, followed by a broader conversation that includes your own questions and perspectives. It is my privilege now to turn the floor over to Professor Squires to get us started.
Good afternoon. We need more coffee, obviously. Ben Franklin notwithstanding, what do we really want? There's also a little extra chocolate cake out there from another program. But thank you for coming out, especially on a day, as some of my co-panelists were saying, is one of the nicer and sunnier than we've had in quite some time. And thanks to Alan for getting us organized and having some lovely conversations with us to get us sparking about today's panel. Although I think my comments are a bit more reflective of a mind in flux than maybe a 15-minute presentation should be. But it's been a difficult year, hasn't it? And for somebody who studies race and media, it's a bit depressing to do your job. So, and also as director of graduate studies and as an educator and working in high schools as well as here at the University of Minnesota, I've noticed amongst students and colleagues how people are dealing with the difficulties and the stresses of navigating all these rapid waves of news and events and change and disheartening announcements. And more recently, I think of our friends in Florida, our friends who are still recovering in Puerto Rico, our friends still recovering in New Orleans and Flint and other places in North America and around the globe. And it feels a little heavy sometimes because our society is in trouble. Our planet's in trouble. And we see many people being rewarded for enacting so much brutality, for making brutality a large-scale enterprise for profit. And fear is rampant, and despair is rampant. So instead of doing my work, I've been turning to poetry more and more, not necessarily for comfort, but for inspiration. And I've been returning to the poems of Lucille Clifton, particularly the volume Mercy, which is something we're in short supply of these days. And so I want to share with you a fragment from a poem called Message from the Ones. And it reads, "The patience of the universe is not without end. So might it slowly turn its back. So might it slowly walk away, leaving you alone in the world you leave your children." Our world needs a change. A liberal arts college that hopes to be standing and relevant in the next 50 years, I would say, needs to be part of that change. We should be eager to make ourselves ready for that work as educators and researchers, to build our capacity and our students' capacity for imagination, to imagine a better world, to nurture in our students and each other the kinds of skills to help navigate that imagination towards that better world, to nurture the type of curiosity and vulnerability that can envision together, collaborate to make the necessary, perhaps dramatic changes that we need to secure a future. The liberal arts should create and support spaces where people can imagine together, experiment together, and heal together those wounds that restrict our ability to be free of fear. We need to examine the harms our own institution has been party to or has perpetuated that foster fear rather than freedom, violence rather than vulnerability, restriction instead of redistribution and reparation. Dr. Carolyn Hill said this in a speech I was able to see a few months ago. She said, "Content mastery does not yet protect the powerless. Telling our students to work hard, keep their heads down, and use the privileged access they have to higher education now and save the politics for later doesn't help them or us navigate and solve the problems of injustice and brutality that stalk us here on this campus and off of this campus. So Dr. Hill suggested we need to talk about the way we talk, to talk about how we talk about our responsibilities. If we're going to take responsibility for training students and producing knowledge that gets us through these crisis times, we need to think about how we create spaces of freedom and ethical exploration, to consider whether our focus on increasing access is legitimate if it is not accompanied by an equally, if not greater, urge to increase justice, a both-and approach, so to speak. A kind of visionary pragmatism is needed to build hope for something beyond the status quo, beyond delaying the inevitable. If we center justice, then we have to consider the lives and experiences of those who have been denied justice. We must seek the wisdom of those who have managed to survive with spiritedness the assault on their bodies and their very humanity. We need to cultivate a sense of interdependence and environments where self-reflection and ethics of care are valued. And I would say we need to encourage ourselves to take up the stance of the witness as well as the skills of the analyst. Toni Cade Bambara wrote that change begins at home. We must first study ourselves, investigate our habits of mind and practices to discern where we might be harboring false binaries, imposing unfair standards, or dismissing viewpoints. We may find we are reifying problematic structures that are the roadblocks to change, roadblocks to freedom. Domination succeeds by cutting people off from one another. One of our challenges as we envision the liberal arts evolving over the next 10 or 20 or 50 years is to be honest about how our habits of mind might be part of our current dilemma with domination. Our current situation where democracy seems under siege, where tyranny is being justified as a necessary evil in an era of catastrophic change. Domination succeeds by cutting off people from one another. Thus, we should ask, how much do we in the liberal arts nurture collaboration, collective knowledge production? How much are we able to be vulnerable to each other as we do these things? Do we continue to elevate the image of the lone scholar above all other ways of knowing? Do our habits of mind and pedagogy replicate the patterns that support separation, that encourage us to cut ourselves off from one another or even from our own bodies? So I've been thinking a lot about how I can take up the responsibility to examine and to fiercely challenge myself to see the ways my practices of teaching and researching can embrace collaboration as a rigorous methodology of collective knowledge production, as Nash and Falcone put it, to be congruent with practices of resistance. To be sure, individual intellectual efforts are very valuable. They might even be irreplaceable in the production of knowledge, but so too are collective ways of knowing and being that aren't ever reducible to one person's ingenuity. To engage in reciprocal collective knowledge building, we have to know how to be vulnerable. We have to be truly open to listening to others, to having our assumptions challenged, to not just guarding our silos, to uncover the places where we feel fear or resistance to change. We have to be willing to be wrong and not feel that as shame or falling apart, our world ending. We have to trust that no one will use our faults as a weapon against us. Working in this kind of radical collaboration isn't just about assigning a group project or offering co-authorship every so often. That won't cut it. The aim is to encourage ways of relating to each other across contexts and institutions where we can engage collectively in action to struggle to heal, repair, and transform ourselves and the world. A transformation that hopefully will be in line with the ethical, humane understandings of each and everyone's value. Lately, many people have taken to speaking in apocalyptic terms, possibly with good reason. People are in fear of the rapid, violent changes and uncertainties they see in the world. The world they know has been turned upside down, or is, at least in their eyes, significantly off kilter. But world-making is an imaginative act. Our planet Earth is a fact. Our worlds, though, may be speculative fictions. We have so many lessons to learn from the peoples whose worlds have been destroyed, who had to build new ways of living and coexisting and remaking home, family, and culture after vicious attacks, ethnocentric campaigns, forced removals, slavery. Their worlds ended, and a new world had to be created. Collectively, they engaged in world-making, and collectively, they heal. The liberal arts have much to learn from those ongoing journeys in the diaspora, after land theft, after genocide. And so I'll end with another fragment from Lucille Clifton. In the geometry of knowing, we have no new thing to tell, only the same old almanac. January, love one another. February, whatever you sow, you will reap. What has been made can be unmade. It is perhaps a final chance, not the end of the world, of a world. Thank you.
Hi. Okay, so thank you. I thought that was very interesting, and now I feel really challenged to produce something as interesting and motivating and compelling as that. So mine won't be, but hopefully I will bring up some questions or perspectives that are maybe interesting, but I really liked that. So I'm going to start talking about me, because that's a little bit what I do best, and I'm just sort of used to always thinking about my own research and explaining that. So that's how I'm going to do it. But I came to the U a few years ago, 3 years ago. So this is, yes, my third winter, and I'm not looking forward to it. I'm a Californian. But in addition to being a Californian, I'm a STEM person, so my background is math and statistics. And I came to the University of Minnesota mostly because I really liked the way that the University of Minnesota thought about social sciences and what CLA was. I found this to be a place where, at least when I interviewed here and talked to people about it, where I really felt like social sciences were taken seriously. Like there were opportunities to be funded. I have these great resources through NASA and NSF and NIH, but I felt like at the U, it was going to be a place where I could try new things, risky things, and the U was going to be willing to fund that. So I didn't have to go to sort of these established domestic science organizations. I could find that support here and then maybe prepare something later on. And that I'd never seen any kind of investment at any of the other institutions that I'd been at, like what I saw here. So I was thrilled. And as a STEM person, but as a person who's asking questions about health and development and really kind of wants to pull things apart, I felt like I could do that a little bit more here than where I had been where I'd ever seen it done. Anyway, so the types of questions that I ask or the types of projects that I investigate are often funded by organizations so one of the new projects I have is funded by the Gates Foundation, and then I also have funding from USAID. They have very clear ideas of what they want me to do when I go into sub-Saharan Africa to collect data. I feel like I want to change those approaches a little bit and do something a little bit different, and I want to learn from my colleagues in CLA who are kind of pulling apart some of these colonial histories and development projects and those types of things. So that was really what I was excited about doing, to do Gates research, but to do it in a way that was sort of pushed and challenged by some of these theoretical perspectives. And so I was excited about CLA for that, and excited about my own department in geography for being able to help me do that in a better way. Okay, so that was before I came. And then I came here, and it ends up, while I feel very supported, there ends up being a lot of barriers. And Kathryn talked a little bit about them when she mentioned the word silos, which we've all heard here and in other places. But what does that actually mean in my research? And how do we deal with that? So that's kind of what I wanted to talk a little bit about. And I see organizations through CLA in the university, like DASH. I guess these are primarily university. DASH, the Digital Arts, Sciences, and Humanities through the libraries, and IAS, and funded through or organized through a couple of different campus projects. Grand Challenges, and ISRD, which is the Institute for Social Research and Data Innovation. All of those, and those are just the three that I'm primarily involved with, provide really exciting ways to think and apply work and do things in different ways that bring in different perspectives from different departments. But the way that they end up being implemented, I think there are a number of challenges. So I just wanted to kind of highlight where I think those challenges are, and maybe where I think that we can kind of continue to be this sort of leading university that does take social sciences seriously. So of the three main ideas, I'm just going to talk about three because we always talk about three ideas or topics that I think are sort of fundamental to considering as we push the U into a different, and CLA into a different future. Thinking about undergraduate and graduate education specifically. So again, as a STEM person, there are particular challenges that I face. A lot of my research is funded through grants, and figuring out how to do grant funding while also supporting my undergraduates, managing teaching, and also dealing with the fact that I end up with a lot of course buyouts in order to support all the research projects that I have pledged to do to different organizations. So those are really big conflicts that some of us are facing in CLA, this deep commitment to undergraduate education, but also this deep commitment to externally funded research, and trying to put those pieces together so that we can incorporate undergraduates, but that we can also still continue to advance our own research, which often requires sort of these major externally funded projects. So I feel like there's an opportunity for us to do more, bringing undergraduates in, and to maybe change a little bit the approach to teaching and research. And I'm not quite sure how that's going to look yet, but I do like the idea, this work-ready focus of CLA. I feel like that can be brought into this sort of research space while also helping undergraduates become work-ready. Okay. Additionally, graduate students, I think, are also needing to come out with a wide range of tools and skills, kind of like Kathryn. We have these big, like Kathryn mentioned, we have these big challenges. I work in climate change, so the last couple of days, especially with the recent IPCC report about by 2030, we're going to have this major 2-degree Celsius temperature increase. And so that is fundamental to my research projects. And it really it makes us feel motivated to act very quickly and to figure out what to do very quickly. And I know that students are trying to develop these skills, but they need a lot of support to put these sort of interdisciplinary projects together. And we still work, my graduate students still work in very narrow spaces, partly because publishing is kind of challenging, at least in social science, quantitative social sciences, in an interdisciplinary framework. And so I feel like if we could continue to support graduate students and and build even more supportive systems so that graduate students themselves can be the ones maybe that help us remove some of these walls between disciplines. And again, the Grand Challenges courses are excellent for that, but I'd like to see how we can do that in CLA. And even within departments, there are some major challenges, subdisciplinary challenges that I think could be bridged. So another issue kind of related to that is the time that faculty have to also continue to develop their own skills and build on their own sort of interdisciplinary interests. And some of these I think are structural. It would be great for some of us to be able to move into other departments outside of CLA, within CLA or outside of CLA. I know best, I think, the skills that I'm interested in learning to move my projects forward, or the space, the intellectual space that I need to be in. So for example, I'm working a lot on hydropower. I need to be around, I could come up with new ideas and more creative ideas if I was surrounded by engineers, or if I had access to a little bit more sort of daily contact, rather than just popping by once a semester or once a year to an engineering talk, but actually being brought in and having sort of those daily casual conversations where new ideas can form. But we're so constrained in important ways, but I feel like there's a potential for us to kind of change some things if we gave a little bit more flexibility with where we spent time and how we could then develop intellectually. And then I think as part of that would be giving faculty within departments and also across departments time. These are often uncomfortable and embarrassing conversations when you're trying to learn new terms in different disciplines, and when you have to put yourself into the position of being a beginner again, and we don't always have the time or the emotional energy with our current schedules, our current teaching, our current research loads to really push ourselves out there and be comfortable putting ourselves in that position of beginner, of a new learner. But I feel like until we can really communicate across these different disciplines and across these different, there's so much jargon, and so that takes time to sort of learn and work through that, and it can be a bit risky because you don't always know if your project is going, or these conversations are going to produce something fruitful. But that has to be something that we're willing to invest in, and that our graduate students are able to see, and our undergraduate students are also, we can mentor them through those types of processes. So anyway, I have found a lot of support at the U, and I have found CLA to be an amazing and challenging intellectual place, and I look forward to the next 50 years. Thanks.
I just realized, listening to the second Kathryn, spelled differently, what a big tent CLA is, and that some of the differences between us don't have so much to do with curricular interpenetration or the opportunity to teach in different classes and so on, but basic questions of funding, you know. It's really kind of a different place that has, of course, lately taken an organizational turn that has been codified, as it were, in the binary structure of CLA itself, which is now organized in some ways in a division between the social sciences and the humanities. So I say that kind of as a preface to saying that I'm going to be speaking very much from the perspective of the humanities, because that's what I know the best. I would like to thank the organizers of the CLA 150th celebratory events for being generous enough and trusting enough to give Kathryn, and me the last word. The inevitable result, I suppose, of occupying the last panel on the last day, right before the drinking starts. The best way I know of not abusing the privilege is to pretend neither to summarize all that went before, nor play the role of oracle regarding CLA's uncertain future. And we must say it is uncertain in a country, we now say this with perfect accuracy, and not simply rhetorically, a country run by criminals who despise learning, ignore science, and actively seek, along with countries like Saudi Arabia, Turkey, India, Hungary, and Myanmar, to silence its intellectuals. The university, to all of them, is a research warehouse to be raided from time to time not a place to search or to learn, since they really do ardently wish for the public to know nothing. I've watched the CLA celebration with great interest over the last week and with a measure of pride, but also with uneasiness, not only because we chose to celebrate it by sticking to local talent rather than bringing in accomplished colleagues from outside, who surely are better positioned than we are to give us perspective on what we have and have not to celebrate in our 150th year, but also because there was so little sense of debate, despite our real disagreements, and because debate per se, quite apart from its substance, is a vitally important form of engagement in a post-critical age like our own. Debating communicates all by itself. I understand, of course, in some ways, why we opted for the honorific instead, or on reports on local happenings, but it would have been truer to our common desire to make the liberal arts soar, to demonstrate the art of criticism in action, which includes the metacritical art of turning our eyes on the politics of our own institution. Speaking for the humanities, let me say that one of the more troubling developments within its ranks in recent years is the rise of post-criticism. By this I mean a theoretically explicit turning away from the act of interpreting complexities, opposing orthodoxies, and wrestling with antagonists. There is right now a very conscious, one might even say suicidal, desire in some wings of the humanities to be done with all criticism and argumentation, assuming that it is possible, I suppose, to let information and aesthetic pleasure wash over us in a precognitive experience of reading or viewing. I know this sounds outlandish, but a number of books and essays and journals are now involved in this, finding expression in well-publicized movements like object-oriented ontology, post-humanism, distant reading, surface reading, and other movements. Their proliferation is itself of great sociological interest, in part because they are happening now, harmonizing with the anti-debate mentality prevailing in the larger political culture, where the idea of facts and the truth, as we know, are ridiculed and intentionally blurred, and where one finds a more and more frank assault not just on this or that position, but on thought itself. The future of CLA has a lot to do, I think, with providing alternatives to this way of thinking, exposing its political logic, and above all, identifying who benefits from it. The interestedness of knowledge in general, it seems to me, needs to be more openly talked about. Take, for example, the challenges our college faces that have been artificially produced rather than imposed by conditions from without. The central administration, for example, actively limits enrollment in our college, thereby decreasing our relative weight within the university. And the tuition dollars we generate from sizable enrollments are routinely used to subsidize the fiscally dismal medical and law schools. Since these challenges are usually defended or ignored by the insinuation that the liberal arts are less intellectually serious than the natural sciences, or that they are less useful to civic life, I would like to organize my brief comments around two propositions. First, regarding civic life and this matter of utility. The point was made brilliantly by Michał Kobiałka in the opening keynote, but just let me amplify it. For CLA to be relevant, it must not give society what it thinks it wants. The university should not, quote, serve the community, unquote, if by that we mean supporting what already exists, providing expertise for its already existing priorities, especially staffing government or business initiatives, contributing our resources to their already established aims. The university serves the community best by being not useful in that sense, not serving the community in order to serve it. Second, we've charted well this week some of the vital work going on in pockets of the college, but there's one obvious thing we have not talked about. When pushed, we usually defend the humanities with talk of the pleasures of a full life, of thinking critically, of making the cultural monuments of the past our own, and so on. What we don't do is give an explicit description of what is unique to humanistic learning, identifying what makes it methodologically superior in some respects to the natural sciences. Neuroscience, digital humanities, big data. Of the 8 sessions organized for this 150th celebration, about half gestured towards the physical sciences. And this is the way, apparently, that the liberal arts defend themselves. There are sciences of nature, and there are sciences of culture and society. Not to insist on this is to open ourselves up to a problem of labor. The job of a university professor is one of the least compatible with automation, but some of the implications of the digital humanities are precisely to make automation of university teaching seem plausible and even inviting. Not seeing the humanities as intellectually valuable, to put this somewhat more extremely, is a matter of labor. It is no surprise that the administration equates value with what is valuable to the market, and that this expresses itself in practical things like inflated salaries for administrators and exclusive campus subcontracts to classroom technology vendors, advertisements on school IDs, disastrous workflow software, and stadiums named after banks. But what within the humanities contribute to this invidious distinction between the sciences of culture and those of nature? In the face of the digital humanities, for instance, which is less a populist movement or opening than a coerced, or at least heavily subsidized, administrative program and digital mandate, one is met by a movement that characterizes itself as a stern materialism with scientific trappings, stressing technology less as a tool than as a replacement of mind, communicative prosthesis, and economic engine. Nearly every one of my PhD advisees now applying for jobs has been forced to give lip service to the digital humanities in their job letters, or in some cases to completely retool in order to fit under its umbrella at the 11th hour. These are not intellectual choices, but peremptory requirements carried out over the heads of programs and curricula, in which students are forced into post-humanistic methodologies if they wish to be hired. I take this to be part of the environment of the post-critical period I'm describing. The digital humanities, of course, are highly varied, and there is some excellent work going on under its name, and some of the very critiques I'm now offering can be found among those within its ranks. But on the whole, and as a foundation-driven, government-sanctioned, and think tank glorified trend, it announces itself as nothing less than a new epistemology, one that supersedes vagaries and subjective detours by recourse to quantities and modeling, rather than questioning, skepticism, and negation. With its powerful search engines and hyperlink websites, it forgets to distinguish between information and knowledge, and naively assumes that more of the former produces more of the latter. It is not a case of the humanists using digital technologies, none of us don't, but of rendering criticism irrelevant or offensive, disparaging philosophical speculation, displaying indifference to thought on the grounds that unexpected answers can be purchased at the price of depersonalized objectivity. Its sublime is the human superseded. The paradox of this sort of trend, which is all around us, is that it ignores the parasitic nature of business on precisely the territories usually occupied by the humanities, although not by using their methods. The dot-com sector of the economy shifts away from primary production of hardware and infrastructures to harnessing the flow of images and ideas. The centers of American capitalism now reside in the evanescence of entertainment, information, and finance, not machine tools, steel, and agriculture, although military aircraft missiles and other weaponry remain prominent, of course, and the virtual world is, after all, built on vast underground warehouses of computer banks bolted to the floor in a refrigerated basement somewhere in Nevada. All the same, the major investment foci of Apple, Amazon, and Facebook is virtual reality and artificial intelligence. This curious devotion to irrealities, in other words, has a great deal to do with replacing humans by their simulacra, the two obvious objectives, lower costs and obviating all critical reflection. The central economic fact of the most technically advanced countries is to numb human analytical capacities, blunt and manipulate the sensorium, and divert humans from the fact that they make reality in their spiritual and intellectual encounter with the world. Speculative intellectual work and its ability to abstract from a set of determinations is, in this curious and again paradoxical sense, the only guarantor of materialism as a philosophical and political position, and an important line of defense against Silicon Valley. Anyone who has followed the use of algorithms in bot warfare over elections, or the uses of Facebook to create pockets of politically directed fantasy, knows how perfectly inverted is this world of the critical humanities and this corporate vision's hideous doppelganger. The Betsy DeVos brand of attack on public education, the defunding of public universities, and the new culture wars of various right-wing free speech scams, the bid to disallow criticism of Israel on human rights issues, and above all, the war of attrition on tenure in the form of adjunct labor, is not only about financial or political convenience, but a deliberate attack on speculative, critical work, the kind, in the reality of our society, found in the liberal arts and not in the natural sciences or the professional schools. Just as the humanities find their way to post-critical theories and increasingly mimic the natural sciences, it is precisely the humanities' expertise in reading images, words, symbolic regimes, and subjective states that is most needed to critique the very society that is mimicking their practices, if only to subvert them. We live, we are told, in an information economy, which means both that information as ads, patents, images, Wikipedia entries, YouTube lectures, and so on, now has a market, as well as that people in large numbers now buy and sell it as discrete units, whereas before this information was more or less free, if more difficult to access. But just as globalization heightened border wars, so does the information economy bring with it the increased privatization of information. What stocks will rise or fall, what markets are about to open because of new legislation, who the government is surveilling, what corrupt business practices dictate the latest piece of congressional legislation, all of these depend on closely guarded information, which is routinely bought and sold and protected at great cost. It is the humanities that are poised to expose these sorts of contradictions and alone able to understand their dialectical logic. Even though the natural and physical sciences have done much that is admirable to perfect and regulate man's faculties, they've had almost nothing to say about the political and cultural environments in which their learning takes place. Modern science is to that degree a byproduct of a complicated prior social and cultural conditioning about which it is generally ignorant. The humanities offer a more generous awareness, combining in vast erudition with a free associative movement. It joins together into one things that are scattered, its diversity making it possible for the researcher to see connections invisible to specialists and hidden from scientific methods that, in order to achieve the dream of absolute certainty, narrow their object of inquiry, looking at ever smaller parts of the whole, whereas the humanist studies the whole human being as part of a social totality. To this limited degree, we can say that the humanities in some way hold priority over the hard sciences. For the semantic architecture upon which the analyses and measurements of science rest are the very aspects of human activity that the post-critical humanities wants to demote, cast suspicion on, or free analysis from. If the question is what we are, then bearing witness to the temporal unfolding of social environments over historical time supersedes the tyrannically empirical now of experimental observation. As we find in recent narratives of the Big Bang, the God particle, and the selfish gene, whenever the physical sciences try to weigh in on the whole person, society, human life, or to put this another way, whenever they encroach on the domain of the humanities by attempting to explain in lay terms what they might contribute to the big questions of existence, They're forced to repeat theories already found in literature and philosophy, often from antiquity. CLA's relationship with the central administration, for many of these reasons, is an antagonistic one. And honestly, I think the future of our college relies on our seeing that more clearly and frankly admitting it. We all face the possibility of what Benjamin Ginsberg has rightly called the all-administration university, where teachers and students, and this would be another monstrous dialectical joke, are eliminated from or made ancillary to the institution set up precisely for them. Luckily, education is vitally face-to-face and personal. It cannot achieve its ends without physical presence and aleatory encounters. It is about the relationships one makes in and outside of the classroom, learning about sex, planning for marriage, sizing people up, learning how to speak before others, how to negotiate sinks of dirty dishes, read the truth or falsity, the sincerity or bad faith of others around you as you respond to the same questions. The mediations of distance learning, not to mention Facebook, Twitter, and Skype, blunt and distort presence, but our own epistemology must not pretend that is not so, as it does, in my view, in the main branches of the digital humanities, in the name of supposedly inevitable and largely beneficial developments in technology that always are talked about whenever the future is invoked. But of course, even if it is conceded that the human is indispensable, this does not mean that the strategy will not shift to the mechanization of the human, imposing on them repetitive quantifiable tasks and evaluative metrics. This has, from the 1940s, been the stated dream of cybernetics. This tension between, on the one hand, the advertising requirements for the rhetoric of excellence, partly embodied in the afflatus of the Don, which often takes shape, for example, in those familiar adulatory interviews with star professors in alumni magazines. And on the other, the directive to make everyone drones, including the star professors and not only the adjuncts. That, in the last analysis, is incommensurable. The all-administrative university is an expression at a higher level of what occurs at the lower level of school boards and PTAs, a fear of those who know history, society, culture, and who can express themselves well. One always talks about the future of something by looking at its past. On the basis of our past, I see the future of CLA in organizations that can act swiftly and in unison, organizations that are not consultative fig leaves for administration fiat, like our University Faculty Senate or College Assembly, whose purpose is to give the appearance of deliberating over policies that have already been determined behind closed doors. Changing the rules of faculty senates to transform them from worse than meaningless consultative bodies to decision-making bodies. Boycotting university governance bodies if these conditions are not met. Demanding faculty representation on the board of trustees by lobbying the legislature, which in my experience is much more receptive to direct faculty governance than the university administration itself. Instituting routine evaluative mechanisms by the faculty of the administration at all levels, including the president and provost, and for the faculty to provide a vivid, publicly available picture of confidence or lack of confidence in the administration, publishing those results with much fanfare every year in the local press until it has become expected and anticipated. Demanding regularly scheduled, obligatory open forums where the faculty can interrogate the president over proposed policies and long-term university goals, exposing him or her to harsh criticism if they refuse to participate. Arguing on radio, television, and the print media on behalf of the humanities, but also demanding that the financial details of university operation be made publicly available in a readable, accessible form, not as now with its details buried in dozens of in-house publications, open to public view theoretically, but practically invisible. Demanding that the president and provost sign on to a declaration that the liberal arts are at the very center of higher education and that their support will reflect that centrality. There are many ways to celebrate the college on its 150th anniversary. I wanted simply to strike one possible note, but hopefully an important one, that we do that best by saying no to what is and by being critical, above all, of ourselves. Thank you.
So at this point, we are opening up the conversation to hear questions and perspectives from those that are here and reactions from the panel about either things that were highlighted in the reflections or new things that you are pondering or were provoked by some of these comments. So please raise your hand, the mic will come to you, and please make sure your comment is with the mic so that we can all hear you.
Hi, my name is Ann. I do academic technology in Lattice. And I was really interested in your comments about online and distance learning. I just wondered if I could hear more about what others on the panel think about the future of online and distance learning. And I will say that when I'm thinking about online and distance, I'm thinking about it as part of a set of experiential pieces of learning, service, in addition to what we do already with service learning, learning abroad, thinking about how we can add digital literacy and the skills of learning online and collaborating online. So that's what I'm thinking about when I'm asking that question.
I'll start. So I'm actually thinking about right now developing an online methods course because we need an online methods course, I think, because we want to facilitate student access to online courses and feel like methods would be, well, that's my expertise, but feel like there is a way to think about statistical analysis and statistical techniques within within CLA that will give students that will sort of demand that students think about the ethics and morality involved with using quantitative data. So, but I feel like I want it to be available online because I want it to be a course that is accessible to a wide range of students because I'm really committed to this idea of work ready but also feel like we have this job in CLA to make sure that we're thinking about these important critiques of quantitative and bringing those in, but giving students who are going out potentially to use these techniques this sort of greater depth and ability to kind of think critically while they do sort of big data analysis or those kinds of things. So we're thinking about that in geography and IM in particular.
I haven't done any distance learning or online course creation before, so I haven't really thought about it all that much. But one thing I am concerned about is thinking about how online learning might become a part of a tiered system where some people are able to have what I think is a robust face-to-face campus experience that embodied experience is something that I think is qualitatively different than a complete degree that was all online. But I also do know that for certain students, because of differences in ability or in differences in geography, that distance learning is a very valuable tool for certain situations. And so to be really mindful about when online learning is being used as just a cost-saving tool or a way to say you're facilitating access, but you're really only facilitating access to a very specific strata of education, as versus actually opening up the university in other ways that are much more interactive and engaging
to a broader swath of people who have been limited in access before. So that's kind of my take on it, is that I don't think that digital learning in and of itself is a bad thing, but I do think that sometimes it's cynically used in the name of access instead of actually truly opening up access to people who have been excluded from the kinds of experiences that we're able to have in the liberal arts.
Right, and just to clarify what I was saying, I mean, it's not only the case that I know that distance learning has supplemented what we do at the university for a long time. It's been an important place, actually, for some of my students to make a living, you know, while they're here getting the kind of education that I was, you know, preferring or showing the advantages of. So, again, it's a question of, like within digital humanities, to use an analogy, there's a slippage that takes place where people who are deeply invested in it seem to think that those who resist it are resisting the use of digital technologies as a kind of, you know, a hatred of computers or machines, or the idea of going back to the old gentlemanly way of, you know, speaking without notes in front of the classroom as being the only model of education. And I don't think that anything like that is the case. The slippage occurs when the notion that you cannot resist technology in education, you know, without being a Luddite, is a way to triumphalize a certain epistemology, a certain way of getting to know material that wants very consciously to eliminate the kind of rapid shifting changes of thought that occur in the act of cogitation. I mean, in other words, there's a sort of desire to do away with mere opinion, which is what they will associate with criticism, by using, you know, computer technologies to efface the personality that, from their point of view, gets in the way of knowledge. So this is what I'm trying to get at, that distance learning is not a bad thing if there are the organizations in place for us to allow the administration to resist the great temptation to eliminate faculty and to make it an all-administration university that is simply involved with things that perhaps they've taped 10 years ago and they keep recycling and getting tuition dollars from, which is, you know, the dream of some people in Washington. So this is the distinction.
So I'll just follow very quickly with, I think, questions that were prompted by the comments that people just offered, that really for the future of online and distance learning, it seems like we need to keep at the forefront of the conversation to what end and to what effect. And if we have not given answers to those questions that are more than because it costs saving and somehow content mastery is all we are interested in the sense of being able to regurgitate information, then that's going to lead to long-term problems of a kind that I think were highlighted already. So keeping those sorts of questions salient in the discussion, as opposed to we've already somehow decided those things and now we're just implementing.
Hi, I'm Beth Mercer-Taylor. I coordinate sustainability studies, which is actually a 5-college program, including CLA. And I'm interested on behalf of actually a large number of students who are gathering to, I think in their words, demand an environmental justice major here at the university, for your thoughts on that very big and intersectional field. And I invite you, as someone who works at the Institute on the Environment, which is very well populated by people with experiences in the biophysical sciences and the quantitative methods, to maybe think about a yes and kind of improv approach to how we might work with our students who might go in all of those various instrumentalist directions. But yeah, this is the demand they have. They're meeting on October 17th, in fact.
Can I just ask a question? You say that it's intersectional and involves 5 different colleges, including CLA. Are you including people like from the environmental humanities, the people who are involved in literature?
Professor Philippon.
I was
who's
wondering
in the
if,
back
yeah, I was
row,
wondering if you,
was
if I needed
the
to introduce
chair
you
of
or not.
that
Okay.
committee
Yeah.
back when it got started.
Yes,
so.
right.
And I think Professor Lisa Dish in political science was also one of the faculty members who co-created the program. And there's a longer story, but some roots, yes.
Yeah. Because two people I just happened to go to school with wrote books from the point of view of the humanities that have really changed people's thinking about the environment. One of them was William Cronin, called Changes in the Land. And the other one is Michael Pollan, who wrote The Omnivore's Dilemma. So, I think that there's something powerful that can happen like through this kind of Thoreauvian literary training that both of them in some ways exhibit.
I guess my curiosity is, what are the definitions of justice that they're working with? So I'm always down for a degree that says justice. So coming from a liberal arts school where the political science department voted to just call themselves politics and take the science out, so this is like, I'm like, wow, this is awesome. So I, thinking about centering justice versus centering the right answer or how to analyze something is I think it's a different kind of training, right? In terms of thinking about where are the injustices and whose expertise in being at the wrong end of that injustice is actually going to be incorporated into the program. So if we think about the diversity of our faculty, so to speak, do we have the perspectives and experiences with being on the short end of environmental disaster to help inform how we're training the students to think about questions of justice versus sort of like a missionary kind of approach where we see the bad things that happen to people over here and we don't want them to happen anymore. So that I think it's a kind of approach situation that where you are in questions of justice will inform how you teach about how justice looks. And so how might the students and the faculty and the staff involved in creating that program think about a university that's on stolen land that has done a lot in terms of degrading that land, to think about bringing in people who maybe have a different understanding about what environmental justice is than the usual suspects who are part of these conversations.
I think I like that idea. I like thinking about what the justice, how do we think about justice? Who's deciding this or defining this? And I spend a lot of time thinking about measures and metrics and data and ethical aspects of big data and data collection. And so I feel like that kind of builds on this idea of how are we thinking about justice? How are we measuring justice? Who gets to decide what it looks like? And definitely there's quantitative, again, we need to be thinking about quantitative methods, or I think we need to be thinking about quantitative methods, while also teaching ethics related to quantitative data and quantitative methods. When I was in school, we never had an ethics course. So we got the data, and we did an analysis, and we gave it back, and that was someone else's results. And I feel like that's not really adequate anymore. And we actually, now, a couple of us, friends of mine, are all starting to think more about why haven't we ever been taught ethics with data questions. And I feel like there's lots of potential to ask students who are thinking about justice, are there measurement questions? Are there ways to get these perspectives when maybe we're dealing with lots of different communities in lots of different areas? How can we think about measuring and documenting and monitoring those things? Or what does all of that mean? So that's what I think.
Thank you for presenting. I was curious, Kathryn, I was really struck when you were talking about dominance succeeds when people are cut off from one another, and also collaboration as a methodology. And I'm also thinking about what you mentioned about adjunct labor at the university and being a grad student that likely is facing entering a position as an adjunct. I'm curious, as you all, as faculty, what does collaboration as a methodology look like with adjunct labor, specifically in CLA, and kind of the increased reliance on adjunct labor and their access to university resources as well?
I'll kick it off. I'm sure everybody's got something to say, but two things. Until the unfavorable decision at a higher court in Minnesota, there was a union drive here that sought to bring together tenure-track faculty, not just tenure-track, tenured, whatever, at all levels, and the adjuncts in a common unit. I was a part of that drive, and I think that that was, to me, the most material expression of collaboration that I can imagine, given the realities of adjunct labor. I know, though, that our current chair in CSCL, Lori Willett, has been very committed to bringing the adjunct faculty, because they teach so much of what makes our department what it is and recruit the most undergraduates and all the rest of it, more into the consultative and maybe even, it's still unclear, decision-making processes of the department. So we don't get to choose, unfortunately, except for the pressure that we put on the dean, how many lines we get that are tenure track, and we still have our curriculum to teach, so we have to, it's kind of a fait accompli, and we receive this from others and have to deal with it. But we can at least try to mitigate its most deleterious effects in the way that we organize ourselves.
I think we're still figuring that out, right? And I think a lot of the conversations that got started with the union drive should continue in terms of developing what that sense of collaboration actually means, both within individual departments, but also across the university, because I think, especially if you look at some of the counter arguments against unionizing, there was clear separations and hierarchies invoked, and fear was invoked, right? If we do this, it will erode tenure further. And so dealing with fear and our sense of wanting to be in a dominant position and trying to figure out where that's coming from, even if theoretically you think unions are great, but not in academia, right? Like, where does that come from? And a lot of people have that, like, it's good for this industry, but not for what we do. What we do is so special, right? And that's another sense of separation, like the academy is separate from all these other industries, right? But we say we produce knowledge, right? And we're obviously being affected by the marketplace. We're being affected by the changes in the labor market, right? And so that, in terms of, that quotation was from Patricia Hill Collins, and she's really thinking specifically about Black women in the world. But if we think about how those, as Mary Jackman says, sort of the velvet glove around the iron fist, sometimes we feel like, oh, we're getting stroked, but actually there's metal under there that can come out really fast. And we have to think about how we think we might be benefiting somewhere, but we actually might just be giving in to being afraid. And we have to confront that, I think, in a real personal way, but also together.
So I would echo the theme about not sort of having worked that all out yet. And I think in particular, one of the things I've noticed is that the patterns of adjunct faculty are highly variable across different departments and units. And part of what I think is important about thinking collaboratively within your unit and across units is to kind of recognize those differences and then be able to potentially come up with novel solutions, novel ways of thinking about those sorts of collaborative relationships. And those are not going to come if we neglect one or more of those dimensions because of that diversity. I think that's just a fact, and it hasn't been kind of fully engaged yet.
That's okay.
This on? Tim, I want to be more provocative if I could. The end of Mihal's speech was educated hope. At worst, what I'm getting today is educated fear. And at best, I'm getting what seems to me to be hopelessly utopian. Can you help me find a university or an educational institution somewhere in the world or somewhere in our past, perhaps the 1890s or 1880s, when people engaged in the kind of deliberative democratic governance that you've imagined here? Is there an institution somewhere in the world that achieves all these objectives, that have fought back digital humanities and the like, and realized these values which you hold so dear? Or is this just some utopian vision that we can all talk about and celebrate, but in fact has no practical value?
Well, I guess you've made your position clear. I had, in a version of the paper which was making it too long, I actually cited chapter and verse. I mean, it's not the distant past in which presidents have been thrown out by the faculty of Harvard, Berkeley, and the University of Michigan, I believe.
I'm talking about an entire institution that's governed by deliberative democracy of the kind that you described.
Oh, there's a long distance between that kind of utopia. Because you said utopia, I think, meaning it was my utopia. But I think you're understanding something in terms of a utopia, whereas what I was saying is to begin with something realistic, which is not generally admitted, given the politesse with which faculty, in all of their dignity and gravity, are supposed to speak to one another and to the public, which is that our relationship in this college to the administration is an antagonistic one. And there are steps that can be taken if one draws those conclusions that are very important and good. So there's a big step between a completely deliberative body of faculty running a university, which indeed would be a good thing, and not simply acting as though the University Senate or the Faculty Consultative Committee is representing our interests. So to me, these are very different things. So let's begin small, but let's begin. So the position is more a political perspective and drawing a conclusion than it is a projection of an inevitable outcome of extreme goodness, if that makes any sense. As far as the humanity of digital humanities goes, it's a juggernaut. I mean, it's heavily supported by foundations. It's heavily supported by the National Endowment for the Humanities, which has a whole wing dedicated to that. We have an office in CLA which is about encouraging the use of digital technologies, which is okay. That's okay. But no, what I'm trying to say is that there are degrees. There are degrees of clarity.
Where do I go to learn about the alternative vision? Where can I go and study and learn how all this works and unfolds and achieves?
If you want me to give you a reading list, I'll be happy to do that. You don't want to read. I think you got to begin by reading, because I think that this is one of the most important ways in which one begins. Right now, there is an enormous confusion about the digital humanities, because I say there's this automatic equation drawn between the use of digital technologies and something very different, which is the digital humanities, which has its own epistemology, which is post-critical, deliberately post-critical. So I think that you're looking at something that is not a part of my talk. It's about taking the first step.
Thanks to all of the speakers, and my name is Kea Ganguly. I think that one way that we might consider thinking about the future might well be to not adopt terminologies and rubrics of understanding that we inherit from the World Bank. For instance, food insecurity. I come from India, where people understand the term starvation. They would understand impoverishment. They understand exploitation. And that, I think, would be good enough to look into the problems that the so-called sanitized and hardly innocent vocabulary of food insecurity. It would be looking at the same problems, but it would do so while not trying to neutralize it, not trying to inherit the vocabulary of institutions which have had a great deal of influence in the way that food insecurity first happened in the first place through various forms of globalization and colonization. So these are, to me, one of the very simple ways in which we resist the kind of discursive regimes imposed on us. Don't inherit the IMF, the World Bank, and other sort of large-scale donor organizations' vocabularies. Don't internalize it. And then try to have a critique that understands that there are histories and economics behind it, so that we don't actually have to run away from it. We can implicate ourselves in it and go forward. So that is more in the nature of a comment. But I think that one of the things we have to look at and also hold our institution by and large more accountable for is to get away from these ridiculous tags like shattering expectations or being driven to discover or driving oneself to discover or whatever it is that we do, and not just sort of ratify them with our own participation in those kinds of programs.
I'll just add an amen to that.
I know we're getting close to the end of the whole event, and I look around, and what message would we like to send to the dean, since unfortunately he's not with us here today?
Wow, need to take a water before that.
That seems to be the statement. You know, it probably, I mean, I'm one of the nominal organizers. Well, actual, but other people did more work. But anyway, I helped organize. And I think probably in retrospect, this celebration, because it doesn't happen very often, does it? I mean, 150th is a big milestone, and probably the last time a celebration of this sort took place was about 25 years ago. So it seemed appropriate to me, at any rate, in addition to what I said about, you know, bringing debate to the fore, because we really are very different. I mean, we come from such different wings of CLA, and there's so many bridges to cross. It has to do with discourse, it has to do with funding, it has to do with personal experience, you know. I'd love a buyout. Boy, that would be great. But, you know, things like that. So there's these kinds of differences, but would be to have the students of CLA participate in this by closing down classes for the times of the day during the week that these events were being held. And encouraging the faculty who teach classes during that time to bring the students here, because they're part of this, they're the biggest part of this college. We might be its historical continuity, and we're the instructors that nominally they come here for to learn from, but, you know, there's no college without them. So this is probably in retrospect what should have been done. I think it was a very well organized, I mean, well advertised event, but people are overworked and, you know, apathetic, and there's lots of other things going on, et cetera, et cetera. But this kind of gesture, it would seem to me in retrospect, with the kind of leadership that comes from the dean all the way down to how important these events are, because it's not like we'd just be eating popcorn and watching, you know, entertainment television. It would be an educational experience for all involved to come here. So to miss one day of class, I think would be not too much to pay. So I think your comment prompted me to bring to the surface maybe what many other people have been thinking about these events that could have been much better attended and would have been had there been that kind of commitment.
So I think I would highlight something that touches on something Kathryn mentioned about structural issues in the way the college and our units are organized. And if we think about administration and how administration is organized, our administrators are on very tight turnaround times because they oftentimes are here for 3, 5, 7 years at a time, and then they move to some other location. And it really seems difficult to have an expectation that we're going to think 10, 15, 20 years out when the people who would be involved in implementing the leadership are completely unknown. And we have no idea what that will look like. And maybe the best laid plans of today will simply be thrown away by the next iteration. And that's a structural feature. That's not unique to University of Minnesota per se, or even to the College of Liberal Arts. It's a structure of contemporary academia, but it affects the ability to envision and enact a future.
Even though everybody who comes in formulates a strategic plan of the future. That's the real
Yeah.
contradiction, it seems to me.
That's right.
They all want to do it. They all form the task forces. They all write the plans, and they all leave
Yep.
or move on. So. And it has to be the same. Well, seemingly, at least rhetorically. It has to have different phrases.
Right. I mean, so in that case, the concern is that you have a rhetoric of thinking towards the future or envisioning new possibilities, when in fact the structures themselves are militating against their achievement, and certainly the achievement of anything that's going to be hard and difficult, which I think our panelists have highlighted, that a number of the challenges we face are certainly not going to be overcome with just a little more effort.
Yeah, and I guess one thing I would say to thinking about, interdisciplinarity, and, we have the 2 corridors now, in addition to the other disciplinary and subdisciplinary divides. And even if it's not meant to reify differences between social sciences and humanities, I think, in effect, it does for some people, and also it engenders distrust. So I can remember walking past Johnston Hall and hearing people talk about the departments as they had been sorted, and they said, over here are the winners and over here are the losers. And that is really disheartening, and it does an injustice to the folks who don't necessarily sort themselves that way. I can be both Gryffindor and Hufflepuff if I like. So I think, I would want to, use this 150th anniversary to rethink that, and to rethink some of the challenges that have sometimes been laid at our door. I was part of a committee when I got here and was all bright and shiny and feeling really great, where a foundation asked us if we could envision a curriculum where students major in a problem and minor in a discipline. I was like, wow, that is real. That's interdisciplinarity for you. And half of our conversations were about all the things that people would do to, just suppress it. And I was like, wow, we can't even get out of that bind. And we asked for more time to keep thinking. And they're like, we're not going to give you more time and money. So how much are we really handcuffing ourselves to think differently because of some of the structural impediments, or always jumping to the why it won't happen? And who else do we need to have in the room to help us get out of that thinking? And maybe the hub will be part of that. I don't know, but I'm seeing Amelia's in the room. But so these are the sorts of things that I would like to see, not so much business as usual.
I was in a conversation with someone, and we were talking about structural issues limiting funding interdisciplinary grad students who needed to be in multiple departments. And I came up with an idea, and they laughed for they LOL'd, because they just thought that will never happen. And I thought, we get so used to, that's just too hard, there are too many, it just doesn't, that would never work. And I feel like we need to be willing to not be okay with that as an answer, to get some of these things to move differently than they are. And I agree about time. We need time. I do think we need time. We need to have the time to have these conversations, to have our students be involved in these conversations. It's difficult as a relative newbie to always know how to prioritize all of these different conversations that are happening all the time, and to not actually know who's listening or if any of these things are actually what the problem is, and then if we're actually getting closer to a solution. So it does feel like a lot, but not like movement is necessarily happening.
I'd just like to add something to what Alan said a little while ago. Having been chair and also an associate dean, I think that we spend too much time being asked to plan for the future within the limitations of budget cuts. So a directive can be, what will your department look like 5 years from now with a 10-15% slash. And here we are spending days of our lives putting together a document that obeys to that cut, and therefore keeps us from thinking creatively. I mean, it's very difficult to think creatively when you start thinking in terms of, oh my God, we're spending so much money doing X, Y, and Z. One PS to our opening talk by Mahal, which was brilliant, Mahal Kobiaka. I want to go back to what, for some of us, is still a very sore point about planning and about great ideas in CLA, and that was called critical humanities. The experiment we were able to have with critical humanities was successful, but we used money that was already there, reserved to be used for something else. Once that money ran out, we could not have any more exciting courses because it cost 2 times, 3 times as much to have the exciting courses. And we just cannot spend that kind of money in the budgetary situation we're in. So just to reiterate that planning ahead for things that will not be done, either because the leadership changes or because they're done in an effort to cut our own budget, has been a disarming sort of experience for many of us who've spent hours and days in committees to do just that, to plan for the future.
Well, I see that we have come to the end of our time, but certainly not to the end of our conversation, I think. We have one more question.
Yes, I just wanted to ask, so I'm an undergraduate student, I'm in my sophomore year, and a lot of you on the panel mentioned having students here to observe and take part of this conversation. So as a student, I'm very confused because, just like they said, as presidents and deans come and go, and so do we. We have a target, essentially, to finish in 4 and not be in as much debt. So how are we expected to think about CLA in 2068? How are we expected to participate in this conversation? How do you expect us to participate, or what would you like us to do to impact the next 50 years, even though we're only here for 4?
Well, gosh, I think about one of the first events of this week when we had John Wright and the panel talking about the students in '68, and think about how in 50 years they impacted this university by creating departments that were never here before and creating space and holding that space even under some serious duress, especially in recent decades. So even though you all are only here for 4 years, students do things and transform faculty as well. And again, for us to think more creatively beyond, oh, we need a faculty advisor for this student group, or we would like a faculty member we'll take them out to lunch because we thought they did a good job, right? What else could we be doing to come together? I am privileged to be part of a group called The Art of Healing, and we've been doing a lot of workshops for women of color on campus about the ways we get separated because we are in so many different spaces, and facilitating the ways to come together. And that has been really enlightening for me to hear more across generations what students now are dealing with. Because yes, you come every 4 years, but you come with a whole different set of expectations and experiences than us old folks had. And so we can learn from that. It has to change how we teach. So we need to hear from you.
Yeah, and I would just say a couple things. One, that you have to think collectively, right? Sort of not about your own experience necessarily, but about the people who came before you and the people who are going to be here after you. That's part of it. But, these celebrations that have been going on for the last week were not only about long-term planning. I mean, this one happens to be directed to the future, but a lot of what unfolded this week had to do with the history of things that have happened. One was just alluded to by Kathryn just now about the effect of the students on the university in the 60s. So this would be a place for undergraduates here to learn about the College of Liberal Arts, where it came from, what it went through, its many phases. I mean, the keynote talk that was given on Tuesday was one that really was highly informative. It would have been great for undergraduates to know what they're paying for, what they're here, what this place once was and what it could become. I mean, so it was informative. That's one answer to your question. The last thing I'll say is that I think of all the constituencies at the university, undergraduates have the most power. I mean, I was invited as a faculty member early on when I first came to the university to be part of the 3 faculty members who are part of a much larger student committee to decide what student groups get funded and what don't. And there was some shenanigans going on by people who wanted to defund the Black Students Organization, the Chicano Students Organization, the gay rights organizations, and so on. And so it didn't matter that the faculty on that committee were unconstitutionally disallowed from voting, even though it's written into the regent's policy that we can vote. It didn't go anywhere. And the protest with the vice president of the university that I personally was involved in didn't matter. But when the students marched on the president's office over this very issue, everything was overturned in a minute. And the funding was reinstituted. So I'd like undergraduates to know a little bit about that kind of history too.
I do think when you're not here, we guess at what you're doing or how you feel about things. I mean, right, but I think like the conversation about online or distance learning, and we all have different ideas based on our own experiences or whatever. And I mean, those are conversations that are better when the students are able to weigh in.
And I would just add that when you leave, you are a citizen, and the university is still a part of the society that you are in. And in that sense, the leaving of the physical place is not the end of the relationship. And in fact, you might argue that a nurtured and sustained relationship over the course of one's life is part of what it means to flourish as a human being.
Especially when you start getting requests for donations, too.
Well, I asked for your patience at the beginning, and as a parent, I would be remiss not to say patience is its own reward. But in this case, the benefits are much more tangible. So let me remind you that immediately out in Memorial Hall, there is food, drink, and bands are beginning to play in the reception. And thank you for coming and joining us for this conversation this afternoon.